You kept your promise? William Carter's voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow it cut through the quiet room filled with polished marble floors and expensive suits, and every eye turned toward the young woman standing across from him, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. And for a brief second, the powerful millionaire who had built his empire on logic and control felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, something he could not immediately name, because the scene in front of him did not make sense. Not yet, not without the missing pieces that only she seemed to hold, and the faint smile on her face only deepened the mystery, as if she knew something he did not, as if she had already lived through this moment long before he realized it mattered. And somewhere beneath the weight of his tailored suit and carefully measured confidence, a memory began to surface, quiet at first, like a distant echo, a cold afternoon years ago when the wind cut through the streets and he had been rushing between meetings, his mind fixed on numbers and outcomes, when a small voice stopped him, soft but certain, and he remembered how he almost did not turn around, how he almost kept walking, because time was money and distractions were expensive. But something about that voice, something fragile yet determined, had made him pause just long enough to look, and there she was, a little girl standing alone, her clothes worn but clean, her hands clutching something close to her chest as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. And she looked up at him not with fear, not with desperation, but with a kind of quiet courage that felt completely out of place. And before he could even ask what she wanted, she said it, clear and simple. "I'll pay you back when I grow up." And the words had caught him off guard because they were not what he expected, not a request, not a plea, but a promise. And for a moment he had almost smiled, almost dismissed it as childish innocence, because in his world, promises were contracts backed by assets, not hope, and yet something in her eyes had made him hesitate, as if she believed it so completely that doubting her felt like breaking a rule he did not fully understand. And now, standing here years later, with that same certainty reflected in the woman she had become, William Carter realized that the moment he once thought insignificant had never truly ended. It had only been waiting, growing quietly in the background of a life he thought he controlled. And as the silence stretched just a little too long, he found himself asking the only question that mattered, even if he was not sure he was ready for the answer. The room stayed quiet for a fraction longer than anyone expected, and the young woman did not rush to answer. She simply took a slow breath as if measuring the weight of the moment before letting her voice settle into the space between them, calm and steady, almost gentle. "I said I would," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that felt far more powerful than anything loud or dramatic. And William Carter found himself studying her more closely now, noticing details he had not registered before. The way she carried herself with a confidence that was earned, not given. The way her eyes held his without flinching, not with defiance, but with something deeper, something grounded. And he realized that whatever had happened between that cold afternoon and this polished room had shaped her into someone he could not easily define. And that unsettled him in a way he did not like to admit, because he was used to understanding people quickly, categorizing them, predicting outcomes. But she did not fit into any of his usual patterns, and that alone made this moment feel different from anything he had experienced in years. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory sharpened, the image of that small girl standing on the edge of a busy sidewalk, holding onto something that looked insignificant at the time, a small notebook, worn at the edges, pressed tightly against her chest as if it contained something important. And he remembered how he had finally asked her what she meant, what she thought she could possibly repay, and instead of answering directly, she had simply looked at him with that same steady gaze and said, "You will see." And it had been such an unusual response that it stayed with him longer than he expected, even after he had walked away, even after he had returned to meetings and numbers and deals that made far more sense, because in his world, clarity was everything, and ambiguity was weakness. Yet that moment had refused to be reduced into something simple. And now, standing here years later, that same sense of unfinished meaning returned, stronger than before, pulling his attention away from everything else in the room, from the people watching, from the expectations surrounding him, until all that remained was the distance between him and her, and the question that had not yet been answered. And as he opened his mouth to speak again, to regain control of the conversation, she took a small step forward, not aggressive, not hesitant, just deliberate, and reached into her bag. And for a brief second, William felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but anticipation, the kind that comes when something long unresolved is about to finally reveal itself. And without breaking eye contact, she placed a familiar object onto the polished surface between them, something he had not thought about in years, something he had not even realized he remembered until now. And in that instant, the past and the present collided in a way that made it impossible to look away. William Carter did not move right away, his eyes fixed on the object now resting on the polished surface between them. And for a moment the room around him seemed to fade, the quiet conversations, the distant hum of the city beyond the glass walls, even the presence of the people watching, all of it blurred into something distant and unimportant, because what sat in front of him was not just an object. It was a memory made real again. The same small notebook with worn edges, the same faint crease along the cover that he remembered noticing years ago, and he felt something shift inside him as recognition settled in, slow but undeniable, and he reached out almost instinctively, his fingers brushing the surface with a hesitation that was unusual for him, as if he understood that once he touched it, something would change, something he could not easily control. And when he finally picked it up, the weight felt exactly as he remembered, light but significant, as if it carried more than just paper inside. And he glanced up at her, searching for confirmation, but she only nodded slightly, her expression calm, as if she had already anticipated every step of this moment. And he opened the notebook carefully, not because it was fragile, but because something about it demanded respect, and inside he saw pages filled with neat handwriting, each line deliberate, each word placed with intention. And as his eyes moved across the first page, he realized that this was not a simple journal, not a random collection of thoughts, but a record, a timeline, a story that had been unfolding long after he had walked away. And his mind raced back to that afternoon, to the moment he had finally decided to do something he rarely did. He had taken out his wallet, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, and instead of handing her cash directly, he had asked her what she needed, and she had told him about a school program she wanted to join, something that required a small fee, an amount so insignificant to him that he almost laughed at the contrast. But instead he had paid it, quickly, efficiently, treating it like any other minor transaction, expecting nothing in return, because in his world, small actions rarely led to meaningful outcomes. And yet here it was, years later, documented page by page in front of him, each entry describing a step forward, a challenge faced, a goal reached, not in dramatic terms, but in quiet progress. And as he turned another page, he noticed something that made him pause, a line written in larger letters than the rest. Every step is part of the promise. And he felt that unfamiliar pressure return to his chest, stronger this time, because he was beginning to understand that what he had considered a passing moment had been something far more significant to her, something that had shaped decisions, guided effort, and sustained belief over time. And as he slowly closed the notebook, his gaze lifted to meet hers again, no longer searching for answers, but recognizing that he had only just begun to see the full picture. And in that realization, he understood that whatever she was about to say next would not just explain the past, it would redefine it. William Carter held the notebook a little tighter than he intended, as if letting it go too soon might cause the moment to slip away before he fully understood it. And for the first time in a long while, he did not rush to speak. He did not try to control the direction of the conversation, because something about this situation demanded patience, something he had not practiced in years. And the young woman watched him quietly, not with expectation, but with a calm awareness that suggested she had already accepted whatever reaction he might have. And that realization unsettled him more than any direct challenge ever could, because he was used to people needing something from him, validation, approval, opportunity, but she did not seem to need any of that. She was simply present, grounded in a certainty that he could not yet fully grasp. And after a long second, he finally asked, his voice lower than before, more measured, "You kept track of everything?" And she nodded once, her eyes softening just slightly, as if acknowledging that he was beginning to see what she had always known. And she took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel more personal, more real. And she said, "Not everything, just the parts that mattered." And there was no exaggeration in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a simple statement that carried more weight than it seemed. And William felt that quiet pressure in his chest again, growing, shifting into something he could not easily dismiss. And he glanced back down at the notebook, remembering how he had treated that day like any other, how he had checked his watch more than once, calculating time in minutes and dollars, thinking about the next meeting, the next deal, the next step forward. And yet for her, that same moment had been the beginning of something entirely different, something that extended far beyond a single transaction. And he realized, now that while he had moved on almost immediately, she had stayed with it, carried it forward, built something from it piece by piece. And that contrast, that difference in perspective, created a quiet tension in the space between them, one that he could not ignore. And he looked up again, his expression no longer guarded, but searching, as if he was trying to catch up to a story that had been unfolding without him. And he asked, "Why did you keep it?" And she did not answer right away. She let the question settle, as if it deserved more than a quick response. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a depth to it now, something that hinted at everything she had experienced since that day. "Because it was the first time someone looked at me like I could become something more." And the words landed differently than anything he expected, not dramatic, not emotional in an obvious way, but precise, direct, and impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, William felt something shift in his understanding of that day, as if the meaning had been rewritten right in front of him. And he realized that what he had seen as a small act of assistance had been received as something far greater, something that had carried forward in ways he had never considered. And as that realization settled in, he became aware that this moment was no longer about a promise being fulfilled. It was about something much deeper, something that had been building quietly over time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And he had the distinct sense that whatever came next would not just complete the story, it would change how he saw every part of it. William Carter did not respond right away, not because he did not have words, but because the ones he usually relied on no longer seemed to fit. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself reconsidering something he had always believed to be simple, the idea that value could be measured, calculated, and contained within clear outcomes. Because standing in front of him was proof that something far less predictable had taken root from a moment he barely remembered. And as he looked at her again, looked this time, he noticed details he had overlooked before, the confidence in her posture that was not performative but earned, the calm steadiness in her breathing, the way she did not shift under his gaze or seek approval from anyone else in the room. And it became clear that whatever journey she had taken, it had been guided by something stronger than circumstance, something internal, something he could not quantify. And that realization made him feel both curious and unsettled at the same time. And he asked, almost quietly, "So this was not about the money?" And she gave a small, knowing smile, not dismissive, not amused, just understanding, as if she had expected that question all along. And she shook her head slightly before answering, "It never was." And the simplicity of her response carried more impact than a long explanation ever could, because it forced him to confront the assumption he had built his entire perspective around, that transactions defined relationships. That value was something exchanged, not something that grew over time. And he felt a subtle shift in the way he perceived the moment, as if the ground beneath his understanding had moved just enough to make him question where he was standing. And she continued, her voice still calm, still steady. "That day, you did not just pay for a program. You gave me a starting point." And the words settled in slowly, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but precise in a way that made them difficult to ignore. And he remembered how quickly he had made that decision, how little thought he had given it beyond the immediate action. And now he was being shown that its impact had extended far beyond anything he had intended. And as he processed that, she reached for the notebook again, gently turning it so that it faced him more directly. And she opened it to a page he had not seen yet, one filled not with entries or timelines, but with a simple list, names written carefully, each one followed by a short note, and he leaned in slightly, his attention fully drawn now, and she said, "These are the people who helped me after that day." And there was no pride in her tone, no attempt to impress, just a quiet acknowledgement of something larger than herself. And as he read the names, he realized that the list was not about repayment in the way he had imagined. It was about continuation, about something being passed forward rather than returned, and the idea lingered in his mind. Unfamiliar but compelling, and he looked up again, his expression no longer guarded, but searching for a deeper understanding, and he asked, "What are you trying to show me?" And this time, when she met his gaze, there was something different in her eyes, not just certainty, but intention, as if this moment had been carefully prepared, and she answered, "That what you started did not end with me." And in that instant, William Carter realized that he was no longer standing at the end of a story. He was standing in the middle of something that had been growing quietly, waiting for him to finally see it. William Carter felt the meaning of her words settle deeper than he expected, not as a sudden realization, but as something that unfolded slowly, layer by layer, and he looked back down at the list of names, each one representing a life he had never considered, each one connected to a single moment he had long forgotten, and for the first time he began to see the scale of what she was showing him, not in terms of numbers or measurable outcomes, but in something far less defined yet undeniably real, and he asked quietly, almost as if he was asking himself as much as her, "You helped all of them." And she shook her head gently, correcting him without any sense of pride. "I gave them the same chance someone gave me." And the distinction mattered more than he expected, because it shifted the focus away from her and back to the origin of it all, back to that brief encounter he had once dismissed as insignificant. And he felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest, not discomfort exactly, but something closer to awareness, the kind that forces a person to reconsider what they thought they understood. And as he stood there, holding the notebook, he realized that the value of that moment had not been in the money, not in the transaction itself, but in what it had allowed to begin, something that had continued long after he had moved on. And he found himself looking at her differently now, not as someone returning a promise, but as someone who had taken that promise and transformed it into something much larger. And the room around them seemed to fade even further as his focus narrowed completely, and he asked, more directly this time, "Why come back now?" And she did not hesitate, her answer ready, as if she had carried it with her for years, waiting for the right moment to say it. "Because this is where it started." And the simplicity of her response carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, and he understood that this was not just about closing a chapter, it was about reconnecting the beginning to everything that had followed. And she continued, her voice steady, "And because you needed to see it." And those words landed with a weight he could not ignore, because they implied something he had not considered, that he was not just part of the story, he was also missing part of it. And as that idea took hold, he became aware of a subtle shift in the way he was thinking, a movement away from control and toward understanding, something he rarely allowed himself to experience. And he glanced once more at the notebook, at the names, at the evidence of something that had grown quietly beyond his awareness. And he realized that what stood in front of him was not just a result, it was a reflection of a moment he had not fully valued at the time. And now, faced with its true impact, he could not simply return to the way he had seen things before. And as he lifted his gaze to meet hers again, there was a new question forming in his mind, one that felt more important than any he had asked so far, because it was no longer about what had happened, but about what it meant for what came next. And in that moment, he understood that whatever answer she gave would not just complete the story, it would change the direction of everything that followed. William Carter felt the question forming in his mind before he even spoke it, and when it finally left his lips, it came out slower than he intended, as if he was weighing each word for the first time in years. What happens next? And the moment the question settled between them, he realized how different it was from the ones he usually asked. It was not about outcomes or strategies or projections. It was about something uncertain, something he could not calculate. And the young woman noticed the shift immediately, not in his words alone, but in the way he stood. The way his posture had softened just enough to reveal that he was no longer trying to control the moment. And she gave a small nod, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement that he had finally reached the question that mattered. And she took a step closer, not to close the distance physically, but to bring clarity to what she was about to say. And she replied, "That depends on you." And the response landed with a quiet force, because it redirected everything back to him, not as a position of power, but as a point of responsibility. And for a brief second, William felt the familiar instinct to analyze, to break the statement down into something actionable. But he stopped himself, because he understood now that this was not something that could be reduced that easily. And she continued, her voice steady. "You thought that moment ended years ago, but it did not. It kept going, just without you." And the honesty in her words did not feel accusatory. It felt factual, and that made it harder to ignore, because it meant that the gap he was feeling right now was real. It was the space between what he had done and what he had never followed through on. And as that idea settled in, he found himself looking back at the notebook again, at the names, at the evidence of something that had grown beyond his awareness. And he realized that he was seeing only one part of it, one branch of something much larger. And he asked, more focused now, "How many?" And she understood the question immediately, not just what he was asking, but why. And she answered without hesitation, "More than I can count on. 1 page." And the simplicity of her response carried a weight that numbers alone could not convey, because it suggested scale without needing to define it. And for the first time, William felt the limits of his usual way of thinking, because this was not about tracking results. It was about understanding impact, and the difference between the two was becoming clearer with every passing second. And he looked at her again, this time not searching for answers, but recognizing that she had already provided them, just not in the form he was used to receiving. And she added, almost as if she was completing a thought he had not yet fully formed, "You gave me a chance. I turned it into something bigger, but it does not have to stop there." And the implication hung in the air, subtle but undeniable, and William felt something shift again, not just in his understanding, but in his sense of what was possible, because for the first time, he was not looking at a finished story, he was looking at an open path, one that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment. And the realization brought with it a question he had never considered before, not what something was worth, but what it could become. And as that question settled into place, he understood that whatever he chose to do next would not just define this moment, it would define everything that followed. William Carter did not answer immediately, not because he did not understand what she was suggesting, but because for the first time in a long while, he was considering something without trying to reduce it into a clear decision right away. And that alone felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. And he looked around the room briefly, noticing the people who had gathered, their attention fixed on the exchange, waiting for him to respond the way he always did, quickly, confidently, decisively. But this moment did not fit into any of those patterns, and he turned his focus back to her, realizing that she was not waiting for an answer in the way others did. She was simply giving him space to reach one on his own. And that realization shifted something inside him again, because it removed the pressure to perform and replaced it with something else, something closer to intention. And he exhaled slowly, as if clearing away the habits that no longer served him in this moment. And he said, more honestly than he expected, "I do not know where to start." And the admission hung in the air, simple but significant, because it was not something he said often. And instead of reacting with surprise or concern, she nodded, as if she had anticipated this exact response, and she stepped slightly to the side, giving him a clearer view of the notebook still resting between them. And she said, "You already did." And the clarity of her answer caught him off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it reframed everything in a way he had not considered. And he looked down again at the notebook, at the names, at the evidence of something that had grown from a single decision he had barely thought about. And he began to understand that the starting point was not something new. It was something that had already happened, something he had simply never followed through on. And she continued, her voice steady. "You thought it was a one-time action, but it was never meant to be that." And the statement carried a quiet truth that resonated more deeply than he expected, because it challenged the way he had always approached impact, as something contained, something completed, rather than something that could continue to expand over time. And he felt a subtle shift in his perspective again, as if the boundaries of what he considered possible were widening. And he asked, more thoughtfully now, and if I choose to continue it. And she did not let him finish the sentence, not out of interruption, but because she understood the direction of his thinking, and she replied, then it will not just be about what you give, it will be about what you create. And the distinction settled in immediately, because it moved beyond transactions and into something far more meaningful, something that could not be measured in the same way. And as he absorbed that, he realized that this moment was no longer about understanding the past. It was about deciding the future, and the weight of that realization did not feel overwhelming. It felt clarifying, as if the uncertainty he had felt moments ago was beginning to take shape into something more defined. And he looked at her again, this time not as someone who had come to return a promise, but as someone who had brought him to a point of decision, and he understood that whatever he said next would not just be a response, it would be a direction. And in that understanding, he felt something settle into place, not a complete answer, but the beginning of one. William Carter stood there for a moment longer than anyone in the room expected, the silence stretching just enough to signal that something real was shifting, not just in what he was about to say, but in how he was thinking. And as he looked down at the notebook one more time, he realized that it no longer felt like a record of the past. It felt like a map, something that pointed forward rather than back. And that realization changed the way he held it, the way he saw it, and slowly, deliberately, he placed it back on the table, not as something he was finished with, but as something he was choosing to engage with. And when he looked up at her again, his expression had changed, the usual sharp confidence replaced with something quieter, something more focused, and he said, if this continues, it needs structure. And the words sounded familiar, like the language he had always used. But the intention behind them was different now, not about control, but about sustainability, about making sure that what had already begun could keep growing without losing its meaning. And she listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting too quickly, as if she understood that this was part of his process, part of how he translated new ideas into something actionable. And he continued, not just funding, not just support, something that connects all of it. And as he spoke, he could feel the pieces coming together in his mind, not as a plan he had prepared, but as one that was forming in real time, shaped by everything she had shown him. And for the first time, the idea of scale did not come from expansion alone. It came from continuity, from the ability to carry something forward without losing what made it meaningful in the first place. And he paused briefly, as if checking himself, making sure that what he was saying aligned with what he had begun to understand. And then he added, but it cannot lose what made it work. And she nodded immediately, not because she agreed in a general sense, but because she recognized that he had reached the same conclusion she had been building toward. And she replied, it only works if it stays personal. And the clarity of her response grounded everything he had just said, anchoring it in something real, something that could not be overlooked. And he felt that subtle shift again, the one that had been building since the moment she walked into the room. The movement from seeing impact as something distant to something direct, something that required presence, not just resources. And he took a small step closer, closing the distance between them in a way that felt intentional. And he asked, would you be part of it? And the question was different from anything he had asked before, because it was not about hiring, not about delegating. It was about partnership, about recognizing that what she had created could not simply be absorbed into his world without losing something essential. And she did not answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what he was asking. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a depth to it that made it clear this was not a casual decision. Only if it stays true to what it started as. And the condition was simple, but it carried everything he needed to hear. And in that moment, William Carter realized that this was no longer about continuing something he had begun. It was about stepping into something that had grown beyond him and choosing to be part of it in a way he had never considered before. William Carter held her words in place for a moment, not as something to negotiate, but as something to understand. And he nodded slowly, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition that this was not his to reshape into something familiar. It was something he needed to meet where it already existed. And he said, then it stays true. And there was no hesitation in his voice this time. No calculation behind the statement, just a clear decision. And the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Because for the first time in this entire exchange, he was not defining the terms, he was accepting them. And that realization did not weaken his position, it refined it, and the young woman noticed it immediately. The way his tone had changed, the way his focus had moved from controlling the outcome to understanding the purpose, and she gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that he had reached the point she had been guiding him toward, and the room, which had remained quietly attentive until now, seemed to breathe. Again, as if the tension that had been building was beginning to release. But for William, the moment was not closing, it was expanding, and he turned slightly, addressing not just her, but the people around them, though his attention never fully left her presence. And he said, "This was never about a single act, and it will not be treated like one." And the statement carried a weight that was different from his usual declarations. It was not about authority, it was about direction, and he continued, "If it continues, it will be built to last, but it will not lose what made it matter in the first place." And the distinction was important because it acknowledged both the need for structure and the need to preserve meaning. And as he spoke, he could feel the alignment forming, not just in his words, but in his understanding, the connection between what he knew how to build and what she had already created. And he turned back to her, more directly now, and added, "And you will help guide it." And this time, it was not a question, it was a recognition of her role, something that could not be replaced or replicated. And she held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity behind his words, not doubting, but confirming. And when she finally nodded, it was with a quiet certainty that matched his own, and she said, "Then it can grow." And the simplicity of her response carried everything that needed to be said, because it confirmed that the foundation they were standing on was strong enough to support what came next. And for a brief moment, William allowed himself to step back internally, to see the full arc of what had just unfolded from a fleeting encounter he had nearly ignored to a moment that was now reshaping the way he viewed impact, value, and responsibility. And he realized that the most unexpected part of all of this was not what she had done with the opportunity he gave her. It was what that opportunity was now asking of him. And as that realization settled in, he understood that this was not the end of a promise being fulfilled. It was the beginning of something that would require more from him than he had ever given in this way before. And for the first time, that did not feel like a burden, it felt like clarity. The shift in the room did not come from applause or sudden excitement. It came from something quieter, something deeper, a collective awareness that what had just happened was not ordinary, and William Carter could feel it without needing to look around, because his attention remained fixed on her, on the person who had brought him to this moment without ever raising her voice or demanding his attention. And that realization stayed with him as he took a slow breath, grounding himself in a way he rarely needed to, and he said, more thoughtfully now, "There is something I still do not understand." And his tone carried no defensiveness, only a genuine curiosity that felt new even to him. And she listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed but attentive, and he continued, "You said this started with me, but everything I see here was built by you." And the distinction mattered to him, because he needed to understand where his role ended and hers truly began, and she considered his words for a moment before responding, not rushing to fill the silence. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a depth to it that reflected years of reflection. "You gave me the first reason to believe that effort could lead somewhere." And the phrasing was precise, not exaggerated, not overly emotional, just clear, and it carried a weight that William could not ignore. And she added, "After that, everything I did was my responsibility, but without that starting point, I might not have taken the first step." And the explanation did not diminish her work, it clarified it, placing his action in its proper context, not as the center of the story, but as the beginning of a path she chose to follow. And William felt that understanding settle in, reshaping the way he viewed influence, because it was no longer about control or direction, it was about possibility, about opening a door rather than walking someone through it. And as that idea took hold, he realized that what she had created was not dependent on him. It had grown beyond that initial moment, sustained by her own decisions, her own effort, and the people she had chosen to help along the way. And that realization did not make his role smaller, it made it clearer, and he nodded slowly, acknowledging not just her words, but the truth behind them. and he said, "So this is not about paying something back," and she smiled slightly, not because the question was unexpected, but because it showed he was continuing to follow the thread of what she had been revealing. And she replied, "It never was." And there was a quiet warmth in her voice now, something that reflected both understanding and completion, and she continued, "It was about making sure it kept going." And the simplicity of the statement carried everything that needed to be said, because it shifted the entire meaning of the promise from something transactional to something ongoing, something that could not be completed in a single moment. And William felt that shift settle fully into place, replacing the last remnants of his earlier assumptions, and for the first time, he saw the full picture, not as a sequence of events, but as a continuous line, one that connected the past, the present, and whatever came next. And as he stood there, fully aware of the significance of what had just been revealed, he understood that the most surprising part of all was not what she had done, but what she had chosen to preserve, the meaning behind a single moment that he had almost let pass unnoticed. And in that realization, he recognized that the story was not about what had been given or returned. It was about what had been carried forward, and that understanding changed everything. William Carter stood in that understanding for a moment longer, allowing it to settle fully instead of rushing past it as he might have done before. And as he looked at her again, he realized that there was still something unspoken, something that had been guiding this entire exchange from the beginning, and he felt the need to address it, not out of curiosity alone, but out of respect for the depth of what she had brought into this room. And he said, more quietly than before, "There is still something you have not said." And the observation was not a challenge, it was an invitation, and she recognized it immediately, her expression softening just slightly as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. And she took a small breath, not because she was uncertain, but because what she was about to share carried a different kind of weight, something more personal. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, but there was a new layer to it, something that reached beyond explanation and into meaning. "I did not come back just to show you what happened." And the words were simple, but they shifted the focus once again, and William listened carefully, fully present now in a way he had not been at the beginning. And she continued, "I came back because there was something you never saw that day." And the statement created a quiet pause, not because it was unclear, but because it pointed to something deeper, something he had not considered. And he felt his attention sharpen, not out of tension, but out of genuine engagement. And she held his gaze as she spoke, not looking away, not softening the truth. "You thought you were helping me, but you were also showing me who you were." And the words landed differently than anything she had said before, because they reflected not just on her experience, but on him, on the version of himself that existed in that moment years ago. And he felt something shift again, not in his understanding of her, but in his understanding of himself. And she continued, her tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet clarity that made every word feel intentional. "You did not have to stop. You did not have to ask, but you did." And the simplicity of the observation carried more weight than any praise ever could, because it highlighted a choice he had made without fully recognizing it at the time. And as he processed that, he realized that the moment he had dismissed as small had revealed something about his own capacity, something he had not built his life around, but something that had been there all along. And she added, "That is what stayed with me." And in that instant, the meaning of everything she had shown him shifted once more, becoming more complete, more personal, because it was no longer just about the impact of his action. It was about the reflection of his character within it. And William felt that realization settle in deeply, reshaping not just how he saw the past, but how he understood his own role in what had followed. And as the silence returned, it did not feel empty. It felt full, filled with a clarity that had been building from the very beginning. And in that clarity, he understood that the most unexpected part of this entire journey was not what she had achieved. It was what she had seen in him before he ever saw it in himself. William Carter did not respond right away, not because he lacked words, but because for the first time, he understood that speaking too quickly would diminish the weight of what had just been revealed. And he stood there, letting the realization settle fully, not resisting it, not reshaping it, simply allowing it to exist. And as he looked at her, he no longer saw just the result of a promise kept. He saw the reflection of a moment he had once overlooked, now returned to him with a clarity he could not ignore. And he took a slow breath, steadying himself not out of uncertainty, but out of intention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but more certain. "I did not see it then." And the admission carried no defensiveness, no attempt to justify, just a simple acknowledgement of truth. And she did not interrupt, did not correct. She simply listened, as if she understood that this was something he needed to say for himself. And he continued, his gaze steady now, not searching, but grounded. "I thought I was making a small decision, something that would not matter beyond that moment." And as he spoke, he could feel the distance between who he was then and who he was now becoming. And it was not a distance filled with regret, but with awareness. And he added, "I was wrong." And the words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted the entire room, because they did not come from weakness, they came from clarity. And for a brief second, the silence that followed felt different, not uncertain, but complete, as if something had finally aligned. And she met his gaze with that same steady presence she had carried from the beginning. And there was no surprise in her expression, only a quiet recognition that he had reached the understanding she had always known he could. And he glanced down once more at the notebook, at the names, at the evidence of something that had grown far beyond a single moment. And when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not just awareness, but direction. And he said, "Then this does not stop here." And the statement was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a finality that left no room for doubt. And he continued, "Not because it has to, but because it should." And the distinction mattered, because it was no longer about obligation, it was about choice. And she nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. And for the first time, there was a faint sense of completion in the way she held that moment, as if the promise she had carried for so long had finally reached its true meaning. And yet, as the room began to shift again, as people started to move, to speak, to react in their own ways, William remained still for just a second longer, his focus not on the room, not on the attention, but on the understanding that had just taken shape. And as he turned slightly, preparing to step forward into whatever came next, he realized that the most important part of this entire story had never been the promise itself. It had been the moment that made it possible. And now, standing at the edge of something new, he understood that the next chapter would not be defined by what had already happened, but by what he chose to do with what he had finally seen.